Ms. Pettipat-Taylor for Ms. Wilson-Raybould, seconded by Ms. Haidu, moves that a message be sent to the Senate to acquaint their honours that, in relation to Bill C45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code and other acts, the House agrees with Amendments 1, 2, 5, 6, 10, 11B and C, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17B, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 24, 27, 28, 29, 30, 34, 35, 36, and 37 made by the Senate. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 3 because the government has been clear that provinces and territories are able to make additional restrictions on personal cultivation, but that it is critically important to permit personal cultivation in order to support the government's objective of displacing the illegal market. Respectfully disagrees with Amendments 4, 11A, and 38 because they would be contrary to the stated purpose of the Cannabis Act to protect the health of young persons by restricting their access to cannabis. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 7 because the criminal penalties and the immigration consequences aim to prevent young people from accessing cannabis and to deter criminal activity by imposing serious criminal penalties for prohibited activities, including importing and exporting cannabis and using a young person to commit cannabis-related offences. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 8 because the Cannabis Act already includes comprehensive restrictions on promotion. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 9 because the government has already committed to establishing THC limits and regulations which will provide flexibility to make future adjustments based on new evidence and product innovation. Respectfully disagrees with Amendments 17A and 25 because other Senate amendments that the House is accepting would provide the minister with expanded powers to require security clearances, and because Amendments 17A and 25 would present significant operational challenges and privacy concerns. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 23 because law enforcement has an obligation to maintain evidence unless there is a risk to health and safety, and provisions currently exist in the Cannabis Act to provide compensation should evidence be disposed of in order to be returned. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 26 because mechanisms already exist to provide for public scrutiny of federal regulations. Proposes that Amendment 31 be amended by replacing the text of Section 151.1 with the following text. 151.11, 3 years after this section comes into force, the minister must cause a review of this Act and its administration and operation to be conducted, including a review of the impact of this Act on public health and, in particular, on the health and consumption habits of young persons in respect of cannabis use, the impact of cannabis on Indigenous persons and communities, and the impact of the cultivation of cannabis plants in a dwelling house. 2, no later than 18 months after the day on which the review begins, the minister must cause a report on the review, including any findings or recommendations resulting from it, to be laid before each House of Parliament. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 32 because the bill already provides for a comprehensive review of the core objectives of the Cannabis Act, including a requirement to table a report in Parliament, and because the suggested amendment to Amendment 31 provides for a review of the public health impacts of the Cannabis Act. Respectfully disagrees with Amendment 33 because Parliament already has broad discretion to initiate studies of specific matters by parliamentary committees, and because the bill already provides for a comprehensive review of the Cannabis Act, including a requirement to table a report in Parliament. Debate. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I am pleased to be here today and to speak to Bill C45, the Cannabis Act. First of all, let me congratulate the other House for the remarkable work that they've done in the CALFA review. I would like to highlight the work that all senators have done over the last 7 months, as well as the many committee meetings. We are about to live through a historic moment in Canada. Once this bill is in force, it will change the way that our country controls access to cannabis. This will be a significant change for every single one of us, for governments, Indigenous peoples, enforcement organizations, health organizations, and all Canadians. As I have said many times, our objective with regards to legalization is to replace a system that does not work. We need to keep cannabis out of the hands of our children and profits out of the hands of criminals and organized crime. Bill C45 gives us all the tools that we need to do this. As you know, Bill C45 being presented today is the fruit of over 2 years of study and consultation.
Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulations. The task force consulted with a wide range of stakeholders, from the provinces and territories to law enforcement to health and safety experts. It also reached out to young Canadians, Indigenous people, and many others. Their feedback and recommendation certainly helped shape this bill. The proposed legislation is informed by lessons learned from jurisdictions in the United States and elsewhere that have legalized and regulated cannabis. It included effective practices from other regulatory regimes, such as tobacco, for which we have implemented a public health approach with demonstrated success. As a result, the proposed legalization strikes the right balance between making cannabis legally available to adults and protecting all Canadians. Au cours des derniers mois, notre Chambre a réfléchi à...
Over the last several months, the other place has reflected on this bill and debated it. 5 of its committees conducted in-depth studies and heard from over 200 witnesses. This work has led to a certain number of proposals to amend the bill. Some of these amendments help to consolidate Bill C45.
Have proposed an amendment that would strengthen our ability to keep organized crime out of the legal industry by giving the minister the power to require specific persons associated with a licensed organization to hold a valid security clearance. There is no doubt that this change improves Bill C45, and the government will fully support it. We are, however, concerned that other proposed changes could undermine the bill. After careful thought and consideration, we have decided not to support some of the proposed amendments. My colleague, Parliamentary Secretary of Health, will speak in more detail about this decision. In the meantime, I would like to focus on 2 specific issues that have captured the interest of the other place. Let's talk about the Indigenous perspective. The first concerns of Indigenous perspective on Bill C45. In a recent letter, the Minister of Indigenous Services and I acknowledged the interest and concerns raised by the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. We have committed to continue to take action in specific areas, including supporting mental health and addiction services, public education, and participation in cannabis production, and addressing jurisdictional and revenue sharing issues. We have committed to report to both chambers on progress in these areas within 12 months upon receiving royal assent. I would like to assure you that our government has noted these areas of interest and concern. We will address each area through continued engagement with Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations, and with a standing committee in the Senate on Aboriginal peoples. Parlons maintenant de cultivation et de...
And now, on home cultivation. Another matter that the other place carefully reviewed was growing cannabis at home. As you know, the bill proposes to allow adults to grow up to 4 plants per household. 3 reasons justify authorizing the limited growth of plants at home. First of all, by allowing people to grow a small number of plants for personal use, we are preventing the useless criminalization of citizens who are otherwise law-abiding. Then, allowing the limited growth of plants at home would displace the illegal market, which is unsafe and unregulated and supports criminals and organized crime.
Rules for growing cannabis at home. setting a very low limit on the number of plants is a reasonable way to allow adults to cultivate cannabis for their personal use while prohibiting larger-scale grow-offs. Under the proposed legislation, provinces and territories have the flexibility to impose additional restrictions on personal cultivation should they wish to do so. This flexibility will allow provinces and territories to tailor their legislation to local circumstances and priorities in keeping with the public health and safety objectives set out in the proposed Cannabis Act.
This new legislation is an essential aspect of our public health approach to cannabis. The goal of this approach is to minimize the harm caused by consumption and to reduce the likelihood of problematic consumption. Our public health approach involves significant investments to raise awareness and to inform people, and those investments were made in budgets 2017 and 2018. It also involves attentive monitoring of consequences. With this strategy, we will be presenting Canadians with facts about cannabis. In this way, the government will be able to measure and understand the effects of these changes over time. We know that consuming cannabis does pose risks to people's health. These risks are higher among certain people of certain ages and people with particular health issues. Our goal is to give people the information they need to make educated decisions about cannabis and to reduce the risks as well.
All of this, our top priority, however, Madam Speaker, is to protect our youth. We know that youth face the greatest health risks from using cannabis and are especially vulnerable of its effects. For this reason, the bill contains many measures that have been designed to restrict access to cannabis and to protect young people. This is essential given that Canadian youth use cannabis at a rate that are among the highest in the world. This is why Bill C45 proposes serious criminal penalties for those who provide cannabis to anyone under the age of 18. It also includes prohibitions on promotion and advertising and on products, packaging and labeling that would be appealing to youth.
The bill tabled today was carefully designed to deal with a long-standing problem: the easy availability and widespread consumption of cannabis in Canada. The existence of an illegal market was a problem, and there were no protective measures for the public, particularly young people. We promised Canadians a solution, and we kept our promise. Over the last 2 years, our government has carried out an enormous amount of work in terms of research, analysis, and planning. We consulted different stakeholders, and we are committed to work with our partners. We made strategic investments to inform Canadians of the health effects of cannabis and the risks associated with impaired driving. We also examined and accepted several changes that we found to be reasonable, and that is what we will continue to do today. In conclusion,
convinced that Bill C45, Madam Speaker, gives us legal framework we need to protect Canadians, especially our young people. Canada is well positioned to make this change. We have already a world-class system for the production and regulation of cannabis for medical use. The bill proposes to build on this strong regulatory regime. We will continue working closely with our partners at the provincial and territorial level and Indigenous communities to ensure a successful implementation of this legislation once it is passed.
The provinces and territories are ready, and so are Canadians. As parliamentarians, we have done our work, and we have produced a historic series of legislative measures that are in the best interests of Canadians. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
In comments, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her speech. But clearly, she is not in possession of the facts, because although she claims that this new bill is going to work to eliminate marijuana from the hands of children, it's clear that that's not going to happen. Neither will it eliminate organized crime. We saw that in Washington State, where they did not allow home grow, that in fact that is where organized crime was eliminated. And the minister has gone on record saying what we're implementing here will accomplish that, when clearly in Colorado, who allowed home grow, that did not happen. And so knowing that 4 plants in a house can be 600 grams, and that was before they removed the height restriction, there will be a huge amount. And provinces like Manitoba and Quebec have recognized that that won't keep it out of the hands of children. Her own province of New Brunswick also has lockup provisions that they've put in, recognizing it doesn't. So with that, why did the minister allow home grow to be included in this legislation?
The Honourable Minister of Justice, of Health, sorry.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. Once again, I think we have to make it very clear that our objective in moving forward with Bill C45 is very simple. We've made it very clear that we're moving forward with legalization, as we certainly want to restrict access to cannabis from our youth. We want to protect our youth, and we also want to regulate the product that is on the market. With respect to the issue of home grow, we have to recognize that if we want to displace the legal market, we have to use all the tools that we have at our disposal. We certainly recognize as well, Madam Speaker, that when we look at the medical cannabis use right now, when individuals have a prescription to grow cannabis for medical purposes, they also have the opportunity to grow that product at home. And we certainly feel that when we talk about recreational cannabis, that both systems should be consistent as well. I also have to add as well, Madam Speaker, that for all provinces and territories, should they choose that they want to add additional limits with respect to home cultivation, they will be able to do so. So if a province chooses that they only want to allow 1 plant to be grown, they can absolutely do that. And as my friend and colleague indicated, the province of New Brunswick, my home province, has even put a specific requirement that they are going to ensure, or they want to ensure, that New Brunswickers, if they choose home cultivation, they will have to do so under lock and key. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I recognize that for the minister, for both ministers, this is a very difficult bill. Overall, I certainly support C45. I think they've in general struck the right balance. But I am disappointed that some of the Senate amendments have been rejected, and I wonder if the minister could reconsider. I tried similar amendments when this was before committee. The ones that I could generally lump together are Clause 9, pages 10 and 11, and another one further in Clause 51, pages 29 to 31, ones that deal with what we might characterize as social sharing. I'm very concerned that young people won't realize that if they're 18 years old and their best friend is 17 years old, 11 months and 2 weeks, that passing a joint to them in a social setting would constitute distribution and could involve even jail time. I think that we ought to look at these amendments that came from the Senate. And again, I think the government's done a pretty fair job here. I have a lot of concerns for regulation. I'll raise those later. I'm very concerned to make sure that legal growing outdoors of organic cannabis is going to be permitted. But for now, looking at these amendments, I wonder if there might be some reconsideration around this particular area of concern.
The Honourable Minister of Health. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
My colleague for her question. I have to indicate very clearly that the Senate, as I've indicated earlier, has certainly been studying this piece of legislation for the past 7 months, and we absolutely appreciate the work that they've done. We've given careful consideration to all of the amendments that the Senate has brought forward, and after discussions with my colleagues, the Minister of Justice, and also the Minister of Public Safety, and also many Cabinet colleagues and the Parliamentary Secretary, we've certainly made some decisions to accept some amendments and some that we've decided to oppose. When it comes to the specific amendment that my friend and colleague has mentioned, we really feel that it's almost counterintuitive in order to with respect to the sharing at such a close age. We certainly recognize that it's an area that we've given close consideration, but at this point our government is not prepared to accept that amendment.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Montmagny.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lisieux, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, listen, just a couple of days ago, the Quebec government adopted its own bill for that province. And it was extremely clear about what the province wanted. They decided they would not, or rather they wanted the option to ban home growing. Now, throughout the whole process, they said that the senators did a good job, but I would say they did such a good job that with 46 amendments, clearly the bill wasn't in very good shape in the beginning. It was very mediocre. The reality is that Quebec does not want its citizens to have permission to have plants at home. They feel it's not in the interest of young children. Now, why won't the minister respect the province's desire on this? The Honourable Minister. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Once again, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. On the issue of home growing, certainly this is a situation that we thought about, and we thought about it very attentively. We know that the Senate did an exhaustive study of that, and we really studied all of the recommendations. I don't agree with my colleague when he says that the bill is mediocre. I think that the working committee did amazing work, and we've been dealing with this bill for 2 years, and we are confident that Bill C45 is good. Now, it's important for the other house to do this recommendation, and on this side, we take those recommendations into account, and we do so in depth. We accepted the great majority of the amendments, and when it comes to home growing, we ended up on a different position, although we do respect everyone's work. Now, the other thing, I'm afraid we need to leave time for another question.
The Islands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And, you know, it's a real pleasure to see this bill coming back to this House with some of those recommendations. But despite the fact that, you know, we hear from the opposition some of the rhetoric around increased consumption amongst youth, the reality of the situation is that we know that youths in Canada are on the high end of utilizing marijuana as it currently stands. I'm wondering if the minister can comment a little bit on those statistics and where she sees the hope in this going, where she sees this bill going, and what it seeks to accomplish in terms of reducing cannabis use among the youth in Canada. Thank you.
L'Honorable Ministre de Santé.
Minister of Health.
Madam Speaker, and once again, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague for his very important question. Once again, the objective of Bill C45, as we legalize cannabis, the priority as to why we are doing this, we certainly want to restrict cannabis and to get it out of the hands of youth, because we recognize that in Canada, in many instances, it's easier for our youth to purchase cannabis than it is for them to purchase cigarettes. So we certainly recognize that the current system is not working, and that is why that we are moving forward with this bill, as we certainly want to legalize, restrict, and also to regulate this substance. The other thing as well that I have to say to comment, we certainly recognize that Canadian youth are amongst the highest consumers of cannabis in the developed countries. And as a result, we are taking a public health approach. We are making significant investments in the area of public education and awareness. And we are also partnering with many agencies in order to make sure that we provide the appropriate tools to provide that public education and the awareness campaign that is so needed to ensure that they get the proper information. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for her speech. You know, one of the concerns that one of the members brought up earlier was about having young people together, one that's of age and one that's very close of age but not quite there, and the criminal record that they could get from making that mistake of passing a joint. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your plans are around actually educating young people to make sure that we negate that as much as possible.
I just want to remind the member that she's to address the questions to the chair. I'm not going to answer that, but I will ask the minister to respond.
Madam Speaker, as I was just indicating earlier with respect to the public education and awareness campaign, it's truly important to make sure that the appropriate investments are made. First of all, to inform Canadians about Bill C45 with respect to the coming into force date and all of the information that needs to go with it. But also, we certainly have to stress that the information and the tools that we are going to put in place with respect to public education and awareness is key. I also have to say that the public education campaigns have already started. They started last year, and we are certainly continuing to roll out these products because we recognize that we have to get the key messages out to Canadians, as we certainly want them to be able to make responsible choices. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton. Oh, sorry, I have a point of order from the Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm tabling a government response to questions number 1717 to 1728.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd I'd like to say that this is probably my last opportunity to speak to C45, and so I want to make sure that I give it full coverage. Now, the government says that the reason they're bringing this legislation is that because what's in place now is not working. Well, Madam Speaker, what's proposed under C45 is not going to work either, even with the many amendments that have been brought. So what was this bill supposed to do in the first place? If we refer to the purposes in the bill, it was supposed to protect the health of young people by restricting their access to cannabis. Well, we can see clearly a couple of things in the bill right away that are going to put cannabis into the hands of young children. The first of all is the clause in Clause 8 where it allows young people ages 12 to 17 to have up to 5 grams of cannabis. That is just the wrong message in any universe. We've talked about home grow and how when you have in excess of 600 grams of cannabis growing in your house, your young people are likely to get a hold of it in the same way they get a hold of liquor from the liquor cabinet. And so this is certainly not going to keep cannabis out of the hands of young children. Furthermore, I would say if the government has a belief that the systems that are being put in place in some provinces are going to help out, let me assure you, Kathleen Wynne put in a process in Ontario of LCBO-type stores and delivery. And for people in Sarnia-Lambton, the closest store is London. And if they call their drug dealer today, in about 30 minutes, they can have whatever quantity they want delivered to their house for about $7 a gram. The government's proposed a price of $10 a gram with a dollar tax on top of that. If they think that's going to work to displace the organized crime that is in place, we're sadly mistaken. The other item I want to talk about with respect to the youth is the public education that was supposed to happen. The Canadian Medical Association has been clear that young people who use cannabis under the age of 25, 30% of them will have severe mental illness issues, psychotic disorders, bipolar, anxiety, depression. 10% will become addicted. Where is the public education on that? Where is the message to tell young people today that this is harmful? That message is not out there. Young people are saying it's no more harmful than alcohol. They're not getting the message. The only public campaign that has been done was done by the Minister of Public Safety, who did a brief TV commercial to let kids know that they shouldn't drive while they're drug impaired, which, while true, is totally inadequate in order to get the kind of public education that was recommended by Colorado and Washington State. Colorado did $10 million worth of public education for a population that's a lot less than what Canada has. Washington State did the same. So that we're certainly not going to achieve the first objective of keeping it out of the hands of children. Well, what about some of the others? Will we provide for the only legal production of cannabis to reduce illicit activities in relation to cannabis? Well, if we look at all the people that have legalized marijuana, we see that in Colorado, where they allowed home grow, they still have significant issues with organized crime. The police have a lot of nuisance complaints, and there's entire residential neighborhoods that smell. Lots of problems there. We look at Washington State, who decided they would not allow home grow except in the case of medicinal marijuana. And they were able in 3 years to reduce organized crime down to less than 20%. And because they set the age at 21, they were able to make it difficult for young people to actually get a hold of marijuana. And it's unlikely that 21-year-olds would be sharing with 17-year-olds, unlike the legislation that we have before us. Now, another problem that has not been addressed by this government with respect to the home grow is about property owner rights. In Ontario and in Quebec, if you're a property owner, you actually are unable to prevent somebody, once this legislation is passed, from growing marijuana in your house. And for those who maybe are less experienced growing marijuana, there can be often a mold problem in the house. And I've been approached by the Real Estate Association, who have asked the question. Currently, when there's a home grow in a house and we sell the house, we have to do a total remediation of the mold and a recertification of the house. Are we going to have to do that on all of the home grows? That question has not been answered by the government. The other question that hasn't been answered by the government has to do with impacts at the border. You know, I live in a border community. Conversations have been had with Homeland Security and with the border officials. They have said, since Canada is changing their law, we are not changing our law federally. It still is illegal federally. And we are not adding resources because of Canada's law. Dogs will sniff. If people have secondhand smoke residue on their clothes, if your kid borrowed the car and happened to be out with other kids that were smoking marijuana, you know, if you are a smoker yourself, don't happen to have any with you, but you'll have the residue, the dogs will sniff it out. Then people will be pulled over into secondary, and they will go through the standard procedure there. The problem is there's not enough secondary for the number of people that will be pulled over. And when asked what they will do then, they have said, well, we will put a cone in the lane of the inspection that the person is in, and we will perform the secondary inspection there, which will back everything up. They have informed us to expect up to a 300% increase in wait times at the border. The government has known about this for 2.5 years. They have done nothing to establish any kind of agreement with the government of the U.S. other than to say, make sure you tell the truth, which of course is great advice, but will not prevent the wait times and the problems that are going to be seen at the border. Furthermore, they have not educated young people to understand that if you're caught with marijuana in the U.S., it's a lifetime ban from that country. And the U.S. is not the only country that will ban you if you've had marijuana possession. There are a lot of countries in the world. And so for young people that intend to have a global career, they are not informed about this, and there could be very, very adverse consequences from the public education that has not happened. Now, this bill was also supposed to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system. And so, unfortunately, we know that the Justice Minister is behind the 8 ball in terms of putting judges in place. She's about 60 short. And because of that, we see murderers and rapists going free due to Jordan's principle. Now, if there was an intent on the part of the government to try to clear the backlog and make sure that those that have committed more serious crimes receive the punishment, one of the things they could have done, and it was suggested many times even since last September, was that they should let those who have marijuana charges drop off the list and get out of the queue so that the more serious offenses can be prosecuted. But of course, the government has done nothing with respect to that. And so then again, they are not going to actually offload the system. In fact, there are more criminal charges under this legislation than previously existed. Because now, if you have 5 plants instead of 4, that's an offense. Now, if you have 31 grams instead of 30, that's an offense. Now, there are offenses for transferring it to younger people. There are a lot of offenses that didn't exist previously. So definitely, we will not achieve that goal. And then there was a goal to provide access to a quality-controlled supply of cannabis. Well, now that you've allowed home grow, and everybody's going to be doing their own thing, there's actually no management of the quality control from this product. And so that is also not acceptable. Some of the other unanswered questions that we see have to do with workplace safety. This was raised when the marijuana issue was studied by the original council. There was testimony brought to committee. There have been questions raised all over the place. How are we going to protect the employers who have the liability and the other employees who are worried? Excuse me. They're worried, Madam Speaker, about people that may come to work drug impaired. We don't want to be flying Air Canada and have the pilots impaired. We don't want to have people operating nuclear plants that may be drug impaired. And so now that Bill C46, which was supposed to be the companion legislation to C45, C46 was going to allow mandatory and random testing on the roadside because people know it's dangerous to smoke drugs and then drive a car. So that was going to open the door then for people to say, well, if it's dangerous to smoke drugs and drive a car, perhaps it's also dangerous to then drive a plane or drive a train or operate a nuclear plant or any of these other things. But the question of workplace safety and how we're going to protect and what legislation is going to into place is a total blank space. We have not looked to our neighbors to the south who have legalized, who actually have both mandatory and random testing in place. I worked on many projects, and I actually had an office in the States at some point in time. And so I know they're able to medically screen people before they hire them, they are able to mandatory test them, and they're able to random test them. And this government has totally lacked leadership in addressing the issue of workplace safety, etc. Now, with respect to the actual amendments that have come, some of the amendments were good and some of them were not good. I really think that the one amendment that was brought that would allow 18-year-olds to share their marijuana or parents in a home to share their marijuana. I'm glad the government decided not to accept that one. Obviously, I'm still concerned about the fact that there's even marijuana in the house, but if that would have been accepted, that would have definitely not been keeping marijuana out of the hands of young children. Now, one of the amendments that they did not accept had to do with the banning of promotional things like T-shirts, caps, flags that would have a cannabis symbol on them. And the government did not accept this amendment from the Senate. I'm very concerned about that. There's a lot of Canadians out there that are worried that when marijuana is legalized in Canada, that they're going to use Canada Day to come with flags that have cannabis on them. Everybody will have a T-shirt with cannabis on it, and it will be disgusting. It will absolutely denigrate our country and the people that have served our country and made Canada a proud country. It will deface that. And the government has allowed those people to continue to have that kind of paraphernalia by refusing the language here. Now, it's total hypocrisy because under S228, which talks about, prohibiting unhealthy advertising to children, God, we wouldn't want to see pop or something like that on a T-shirt or a flag. But hey, cannabis, that's okay. So I'm totally opposed to that. Another thing that the government should have taken into account was the amendment that was brought on capping the potency of THC. We've heard reports from all over Canada as people are increasingly trying marijuana for the first time or experiencing BC bud, which purportedly has one of the highest THC contents, and there's a lot of potency. People are presenting at the emergency ward with uncontrollable vomiting due to THC poisoning. And so knowing that, and knowing that part of the intent of this bill is to protect the health of Canadians and of the youth, I can't understand why the government would not recognize that there needs to be some control on the potency of things that are out in the marketplace. Some of the amendments that were compassionate talked about giving people more time to pay their fines. I thought that was good that the government accepted those. I thought it was good that they would consider for young people ages 12 to 17 that were experiencing an offense, that they were going to look at ticketed offenses, which is something that we would have supported, and restorative justice options. If we look to countries that are doing the best job of intervening and helping people to get off drugs, look at Portugal. If anyone is found possession of drugs there, they're given an intervention with a medical person, a psychiatrist, and a legal person who can then try to figure out, what is the root cause of why these people are self-medicating or why they are becoming addicted, and what can be done to help get them off of it in terms of mental health therapies or drug addiction therapies, etc. So, we need to look at this whole thing. The other part that I think is unfortunate is that the Indigenous people have not been adequately consulted with. I was very disappointed to find that from September of last year, when we first heard at committee from Chief Day and from the Métis Nation, they said they had not been adequately consulted. It's disheartening to hear that again, when this went before the Senate, the same message came out that they had not been adequately consulted with, that they wanted to have the ability within their own communities to define whether or not cannabis would be allowed, and apparently under federal law, it was clarified to them that if it's a federal right of Canadians to possess cannabis, then it's not something that they would be able to come against. And there was some resistance about that based on the sovereignty of the Indigenous people. So I think that was not resolved to their satisfaction, and it's worrisome that the government continues to rush ahead when they say this is the most important relationship, the nation-to-nation relationship they want to have, and they're willing to go and throw gasoline on a fire in terms of moving ahead when they've been asked not to do so. So, Madam Speaker, some of the other questions that arose at committee that really haven't been adequately answered have to do with a lot of the detailed specifics about who's going to pay. Municipalities are saying there will be a cost to them to implement, but they've not been included in the cost breakdown or the agreements that have happened. And so that is of concern. There have also been concerns raised by people who currently are consuming medical marijuana, and they're understanding that they're going to be paying tax on that. And typically in Canada, prescription medicines are not taxed, and so as long as they have a prescription from a doctor for their medicinal marijuana, my expectation would be that they wouldn't be taxed. But that's not what this government is saying. There is language in the budget bill also that's a little bit suspicious that says they would exempt people from paying tax on medicinal marijuana that has a drug identification number. But the problem with that is that there are no medications that have a drug identification number because there are so many different components in marijuana that the companies have not been able to spend the research dollars required to characterize or to effectively quality control them to be able to meet a number like that. So that is a meaningless promise for sure. Now, there were some amendments that were brought to bring this legislation in line with the tobacco legislation, and I'm in favor of having those things aligned. But it seems unusual that the government would be spending $80 million to get people to stop smoking, but they'd be spending $800 million to get people to start smoking marijuana, especially when the Minister of Health has just stood up and talked about how they know there's harmful effects. Now, one of the things I find very, very interesting from a timing point of view is that today, Health Canada took off their webpage the harmful impacts of cannabis. This is something that has been on the webpage. I had somebody bring it to my notice and to send me a screenshot of what used to be there and what is not there now. So it's very interesting that on the day that they want to see this legislation pass into law, suddenly they would take off the information that shows that there is harmful effects from cannabis, not just to young people, but to others. And so I would request that the government not hide things, but that they try to be open and transparent, as they said that they are always trying to be, and that they would put that information back on the website, because every place that had legalized marijuana had said one of the most important things to do was to invest in public education. They wanted to target that education not just at young people to understand the harmful effects that this would have on their brain, but also on adults, parents that can influence young people, and the general public, so that they could understand as well. I'm very concerned about some of the unintended consequences that will happen as a result of this legislation. I know that there are people already smoking marijuana today in Canada, but when it becomes legal, there are many more that will decide to try it, and they may not be informed about what the impact will be when they cross the border, about what the impact might be on their mental health or on the mental health of their children. They may not understand what the health impacts will be for they themselves, and they may not understand the ramifications in their place of work, how they're going to impact both their employer and those that work around them. So that said, Madam Speaker, I am very opposed to the legalization of marijuana, which I've said on many occasions, not just because it's bad for you, but because this bill has so many holes in it and so many unanswered questions, and there are going to be so many bad unintended consequences for Canadians, that it will be left to the Conservative Party when we come to victory in 2019 to clean up the mess that will be made by this government moving forward in this rushed and irresponsible fashion to implement this bill. Absolutely, this bill will not keep marijuana out of the hands of young children. It will not get organized crime out of this business, and it will not unload our criminal justice system, and it certainly will not provide access to quality-controlled supply. What we can expect is that Canada Day, you can expect there'll be lots of people out with their T-shirts just totally insulting those Canadians that are proud of our country that are not in agreement, and there are a lot of Canadians that are not in agreement with this legislation. And so with that, thank you very much, Mrs. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to begin by thanking the member opposite for her remarks and her hard work on the Health Committee. Her opinions is always valued. Madam Speaker, one of the things that I think is clear, and what I've found is an overwhelming consensus right across the country, is that the current system of criminal prohibition is failing our communities and our kids terribly. We have the highest rates of cannabis use among the children in the world. The entire production and distribution system of cannabis today in Canada is controlled by criminals. The product that our kids are exposed to is untested, unregulated, unsafe. And prohibition, I think there's generally an acknowledgement it simply doesn't work. And it's only by lifting that prohibition and replacing it with a comprehensive system of regulation for its production, distribution, and consumption that we have any opportunity to bring some control to a situation clearly out of control, which is damaging our communities and enriching criminals. So I asked the member opposite, through you, Madam Speaker, would it be her intention that after the next time that her party may come into government, would you recriminalize this and reinstitute the prohibition after we've lifted it?
I just want to remind the Parliamentary Secretary to address the questions to the Chair. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. And he's absolutely right that when it comes to the situation that exists today, it's not a good situation. But if they were doing what was prudent, they would have put in place a system like Washington State's that actually reduced organized crime's involvement, that actually raised the age to 21 and made it more difficult for people to get a hold of marijuana. Now, in terms of what will happen in the future, I look forward to the day that we are victorious in 2019 and returning to government. At that time, it's like the toothpaste is out of the toothpaste tube. There'll be a big mess to clean up. There'll be a doubling of traffic deaths, which has been seen in every other jurisdiction. The public education that has not been done by this government, that was warned by every jurisdiction that put marijuana legalization in place. That is something that's going to happen for people to understand the harms. But by that time, there will be young people that have mental health issues and all of the traffic deaths and all of the unintended consequences to property owners. Thank you, Madam.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, I want to express what a pleasure it is to work with my honourable colleague on the Health Committee. I have to say that, you know, she almost puts a reasonable gloss on the Conservative position on cannabis, and for that I congratulate her. But really, the position of the Conservative Party on cannabis has been extremely perplexing to me. We had the comments from the honourable member from Thornhill, who compared a homegrown cannabis plant to the equivalent of leaving opioids out for children. Of course, right now in Canada, the reality is with extreme criminalization, in fact, a potential life sentence for trafficking, we have the second highest rate of cannabis use among young people in the world. But my question to her is this, given that reality and given that millions of Canadians have used and currently use cannabis, don't feel that it's a criminal act, and given that her party's position is opposed to legalization, my question to her is this. It's on the edibles and concentrates provision. This bill continues to make edibles and concentrates illegal in Canada. And given that it's one of the purposes of the bill is to get rid of the black market, I wonder what her position is, her party's position is on the legalization of edibles and concentrates, or is she content to leave those products in the hands of organized crime, who are selling those products in some cases without any of the regulations that I think Canadians want to see with those products?
Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from the NDP because it's a pleasure to work with him as well on the Health Committee, and he brings forward many good points. Some of the facts that come to bear on this question, 30% of the market today is edibles. And we did receive testimony from multiple jurisdictions that had legalized edibles, and they talked about some of the problems that they encountered originally with overdoses in children, especially with, you know, gummy bear flavored and candy flavored items. And so having a very strict control and learning the lessons from those people will be important. But once again, the government decided not to accept to have parliamentary oversight when those regulations are developed. The bureaucrats will be able to put in place whatever they want, perhaps not listening to the learnings from other jurisdictions, and I'm against that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saskatoon-Grasswood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. A couple of items. I want to thank the member from Sarnia-Lambton talking about the education system. We've seen a few ads by this government on television, but not enough. They were prepared to spend $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 for an ad campaign. We haven't seen that, even though we could be months away from this bill becoming law, or even weeks ahead. Anyways, one of the things that I did in January was go to Nunavut. They have no addiction centers at all up north. they are concerned. There isn't one addiction center in Nunavut, and yet this government has not consulted with them up there. They are concerned about this because they're taking their people from the north into Winnipeg and even Montreal for addiction centers. There is no plan by this Liberal government to have addiction centers up north, and I'm wondering through you, I could ask our member to talk about the addiction centers that certainly will be needed when this bill comes law.
The member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for an excellent question. Yes, this government has been woefully inadequate in putting in place treatment, not just in Nunavut, but across the country. We can see if we try to compare to other places that do this well, let's talk about public education and we can talk about treatment. Colorado spent $10 million on public education and they got 5 million people. Washington State spent $7 million and they've got 7 million people. Okay, and they spent that in the year ahead of the legalization. And the 100,000 that we're talking about, we have 36 million people, is woefully inadequate. If you think about places like Portugal, the government is always comparing how well Portugal does things. Portugal has 170 treatment centers for 11 million people in a very small, drivable space. That is not the situation that we have in Canada, and we have to start putting emphasis on treatment for people, especially those who are predisposed. Nunavut has recognized the threat, and they have decided not to allow home grow, along with Quebec and Manitoba, and treatment centers are needed there as well.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I've been following the Conservative debate on this issue, and I find it amazing. If you think it through, what the Conservatives want to do, and their position is to decriminalize cannabis. So by decriminalizing cannabis, but not legalizing and putting in the regulations, I suspect that they will find great support from our gangs. That gangs would be the biggest benefactor of, and the criminal element, of the Conservative policy on this issue. Because if you decriminalize it, that means the gangs can continue to get involved because, after all, it's not legal, and now these individuals don't have to go to jail. Rather, they will get a fine. And it just doesn't make any sense. Where we agree, I believe, is that over the last decade, we have seen our youth more engaged in cannabis than any other Western country in terms of the crisis that is currently there. This legislation will legalize, regulate, and educate. There will be, I believe, marginal criminal activities surrounding it. Those monies will in fact be generated for government. I see it as a win-win-win, and the biggest winner here is our young people, because there will be more education, and it will, in fact, I believe, decrease the number of youth participating in cannabis.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader, but instead of talking about hypotheticals, let's talk about what organized crime is thinking about this government's legislation. They're jumping up and down. They're saying, hey, you know what? The going price for us is $7 a gram. This government's going to start at $10 a gram, and they're going to add another $1. Not only that, they're going to do what Colorado did and allow home grow. See how profitable we've been there. Oh, by the way, this government also eliminated the visa requirements on people coming in from Mexico. So lots of experienced people can just move in and take over the whole thing. So I really think that when you think about organized crime and you think about the advantages they need and how the police have already said there's not enough of them to enforce all of the provisions for home grow in this legislation, organized crime is going to be happy, because they're going to make a huge amount of money when people have to go through Kathleen Wynne's LCBO model between 9 and 6. Thanks.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as I tuned in to listen to the Senate debate on the Cannabis Act C45, I was given a stark reminder of why so many Canadians have so little confidence in that unelected, unaccountable body. Certainly, it is legitimately questionable if an institution capable of producing such baseless fear-mongering and ignorance has any legitimacy blocking legislation passed by an overwhelming majority in this democratically elected House of Commons. Disturbingly, in the hours leading up to the final vote on Bill C45, The Liberal government was forced to quietly swear in 2 new senators to ensure its passage, even though they were not present for 1 minute of testimony, not 1 minute of debate, not 1 minute of review of the bill, yet they cast their vote lockstep with the government. Some democracy, some sober second thought, Madam Speaker. Now, after studying this legislation for over 6 months, it's not even clear that all 93 senators actually understood the most basic facts on cannabis, such as the most basic facts about cannabis quantity. While reviewing the Act, Senator Nicole Eaton, a Conservative from Ontario, said this, quote, 5 grams is about 4 tokes. So in other words, if I'm a high school student, I'm 16, I've got 4 tokes in my pocket, which is under 5 grams. So you just don't take it away from me, but I'm allowed to possess it, right? I'm allowed to have less than 5 grams, or I'm allowed to have 0 grams. This is what I quite don't understand, end quote. Oh, there's quite a bit the Senator doesn't understand, Madam Speaker. For the record, 5 grams of cannabis is enough for some 10 joints. That's far more than 4 tokes. Now, given this statement, I was rather surprised to learn that both Senators Eaton and Senator Linda Frum were forced to abstain from votes on the Cannabis Act because they stand to profit from legalization. Senator Eaton declared a conflict of interest over the bill, quote, due to an impending investment in the cannabis industry, end quote. However, until she recused herself, Senator Eaton was an active participant in debates and committee work on legalization, including voting against Bill C45 at second reading. For her part, Senator Frum has a property that will be leased, quote, for the purpose of selling recreational cannabis. After initially indicating her opposition to C45, she then recused herself from debate, deliberation, and voting on the matter. Now, while it may seem like a contradiction to publicly oppose Bill C45 while privately investing in cannabis, such behavior has become disturbingly common in this lead-up to legalization. An emerging group of so-called cannabis capitalists, notably composed of the same police officers and government officials who've spent their years prosecuting the war on drugs, has already begun staking its claim to the new recreational market. Some prominent names include Kim Derry, who served as a deputy chief when the current Liberal member for Scarborough Southwest, the Liberals' point man on cannabis, was Toronto Police Chief. He's now the security advisor for THC Meds Ontario. Former Ontario Liberal Deputy Premier George Smitherman, who once served as the province's health minister, is tied to THC Meds Ontario as well. Former Liberal Prime Minister John Turner is a board member for Mule Boom Organic Inc. Chuck Raffici founded Tweed Cannabis Inc., the country's first licensed provider to go public, while he was Chief Financial Officer of the Liberal Party of Canada. And former police chief and Conservative cabinet minister Julian Fantino, who once compared cannabis to murder and voted in favor of harsh, mandatory minimum sentences for cannabis as a member of the Harper cabinet, has now gotten into the cannabis business himself with former RCMP Deputy Commissioner Raf Sukar. Madam Speaker, it's a travesty of justice and hypocrisy of the highest order that those who fought hardest for legalization may benefit the least from it, while those who've spent a lifetime enforcing prohibition are now lining up to fill the boardrooms of the cannabis industry.
Hear, hear.
Now, those who put their liberty on the line as activists for legalization, who often, in the pursuit of their defense of cannabis, took legal liability, got criminal records, not for any violent activity, but in their drive to get sensible cannabis policy in this country, who now carry the burden of a criminal record for these efforts, have not only been shut out, but the federal government hasn't even offered them a path to participate in the cannabis industry or to obtain pardons.
Shame.
Are they now supposed to sit back in admiration of the moral flexibility and business acumen of their former detractors? The inescapable truth is that Bill C45 is principally about legalizing the cannabis industry, not the plant or its usage. This bill is not about legalization, it's about making cannabis less illegal. If this legislation were truly about legalizing the cannabis plant, it would have heralded the end of criminalization, the end of stigmatization, and the end of the prohibitionist approach to cannabis policy that has been such a failure over the last almost 100 years. Instead, this legislation creates an incredibly complex criminal framework that legal experts and police chiefs predict will result in more, not less, cannabis offences post, quote, legalization. Now, there have been many opportunities to change course as Bill C45 worked its way through Parliament. And I want to be clear that I do give the government credit for rejecting the most harmful amendments proposed by the Senate and for accepting the NDP's proposals in a number of ways, including to legalize the sale of edibles and concentrates, albeit not for 1 year post-legalization. That's unjustified, but that's the best the Liberals would do, and to remove the misguided 100-centimetre plant height limit. Unfortunately, however, the Liberals have also rejected a number of key improvements to Bill C45. Now, I'd like to take a moment to focus on some of the Senate's key proposed amendments and the government's response to them. First is home growing. Based on the advice of the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation, the federal government has proposed to allow the personal cultivation of cannabis for non-medical purposes with a limit of 4 plants per household. But after considering a proposal to ban home growing outright, the Senate chose to amend C45 to allow provincial governments to ban home growing themselves. Now, this isn't a rational or evidence-based approach to cannabis policy. As the College of Family Physicians of Canada put it, quote, banning home growing for personal use defeats the purpose of legalization, which is to reduce the harms of criminalization, end quote. Now, New Democrats believe that under legalization, the personal production of cannabis should be permitted similar to home production of alcohol, such as beer and wine. Personal production will play an essential role in eliminating the illicit cannabis market, since it ensures that individuals who want to consume cannabis can afford it and have access to it in regions without nearby retail storefronts. Now, for many Canadians, particularly those in rural areas who won't be served well by the retail marketing of cannabis, this may be the only way that they're able to get access to cannabis. And I would point out, under the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling, medical cannabis users are allowed to grow their own cannabis. In some cases, they're growing 8 plants and they can obtain a license from another person and grow for them. Wouldn't it be the height of folly if across Canada, one house on a block can grow cannabis because they're growing it for medical reasons, but the house beside them can't because it's for recreational purposes? That is the height of inequity and would make a mockery of the law, Madam Speaker. Now, Madam Speaker, the health and safety issues generally associated with home cultivation, I would point out, are overwhelmingly the result of the large-scale industrial illicit growing operations that operate covertly in residential buildings due to prohibition. This can result in damage due to improper ventilation, and illegal electrical hookups pose a fire risk. However, the personal cultivation of 4 plants will obviously not pose similar risks, any more than growing 4 plants of any other species in the home. I would dare say that most Canadians in an average household have more than 4 plants in their house. Thus, by contributing to the dismantling of the illicit market, home cultivation actually serves to help eliminate those covert industrial growing operations. Furthermore, I want to point out that raw cannabis plants are non-psychoactive. According to University of British Columbia botany professor Jonathan Page, who testified at committee, if anybody were to eat, including a child, the raw bud of cannabis, they would get the acidic form, which is non-psychoactive. The fresh material is not capable of getting you high. You need to bake it or heat it or smoke it in order to obtain that result. Now, the government chose to reject this amendment because they said it's, quote, critically important to permit personal cultivation in order to support the government's objective of displacing the illegal market. Canada's New Democrats agree. Now, on potency limits, the Senate also proposed an undefined potency limit for cannabis products. This is something I think the Conservatives are supporting. On this point, it's important to note that the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation rejected potency limits for a number of reasons. First, they believed that if prohibited, these products would continue to be available on the illicit market. The task force also concluded that there is insufficient evidence even to identify what a, quote, safe potency limit would be. The task force emphasized the significant risks associated with the illicit production of high-potency concentrates and instead called on the government to regulate them within a legal market. I would point out, Madam Speaker, that illicit producers often use flammable solvents such as butane to extract cannabinoids from plants, an inherently dangerous process that can also leave carcinogenic residues on the end product. Product safety was also a concern, as the extraction process may also concentrate contaminants such as heavy metals and other impurities, in addition to THC. So the government rejected this amendment because, quote, the government has already committed to establishing THC limits and regulations, which will provide flexibility to make future adjustments based on evidence and product innovation, end quote. So while we support the decision to reject this amendment, Canada's New Democrats believe that the government should heed the advice of the task force in this area. Now, in branding, the Senate proposed deleting a provision of Bill C45 that currently allows a person to promote cannabis, a cannabis accessory, or a service related to cannabis by displaying a brand element on a thing, provided it is not associated with young persons, appealing to young persons, or associated with a way of life that includes glamour, recreation, excitement, vitality, risk, or daring. Now, the government rejected the Senate's amendment because, quote, the Cannabis Act already includes comprehensive restrictions on promotions, end quote. Again, Canada's New Democrats agree. Branding restrictions on cannabis in C45 are there now. Indeed, they are already more stringent than those applied to alcohol. I don't need to remind any of the members of this House of the tragedy that occurred just a few months ago of a young Quebec girl who died after consuming a high-alcohol, high-volume drink and ended up drowning in a river. And if you look at that product, it's definitely marketed to young people, it's definitely marketed even to children, and there are no similar restrictions on alcohol. That's something that I think this House should look at closing in the future. Now, in terms of parental sharing in the home, just as is currently the case with alcohol, the Senate proposed to allow parents to share cannabis with a younger family member of at least 17 years of age in the home. Now, Canada's New Democrats believe that this was a sensible proposal and that the government was ill-advised to reject this amendment. We currently allow this approach for alcohol because we understand that parents can be trusted to model responsible behavior to their children and to make positive choices for their family's well-being. In fact, New Democrats believe that parental education will be a key component of low-risk use of cannabis and should not be criminalized. So just as after this bill becomes law, parents will be able to legally consume cannabis in the house. And if they wanted to pass a joint to their 17-year-old and discuss responsible use of cannabis, this bill would make that a crime. We don't think that's sensible. Now, the government also rejected the Senate's parallel proposal to ensure that sharing among individuals close in age within 2 years would not be criminalized, and that a cannabis offence carrying a sentence of less than 6 months would not be used in deportation proceedings for someone without citizenship status. Now, the government justified their rejection by saying the criminal penalties and the immigration consequences aim to prevent young people from accessing cannabis and to deter criminal activity by imposing serious criminal penalties for prohibited activities. Madam Speaker, if criminalization and the threat of imprisonment or deportation prevented people from using cannabis, then Canadians wouldn't be consuming an estimated 655 metric tons of it per year, and we wouldn't have the second highest rate of cannabis use among youth between 16 and 24 in the world. And that's when we have full criminalization and life sentences for trafficking. Now, contrasting that, Madam Speaker, a single bottle of liquor is enough to kill a child. And yet I know of no 14-year prison sentence arising from distribution of beer or liquor. But a parent who shares a joint with their daughter or son who's 17 is a criminal under this legislation. An adult who possesses 31 grams of cannabis in public is a criminal. A youth who possesses more than 5 grams of cannabis is a criminal. An 18-year-old who passes a joint to their 17-year-old friend is a criminal. An adult who grows 5 cannabis plants is a criminal. Now, this kind of continued criminalization is inconsistent with a rational and evidence-based criminal justice policy and will only serve to reduce the positive impacts of the bill. Indeed, Madam Speaker, the prohibitionist approach has been repeatedly discredited by its failures throughout history. Now, for far too long, we've wasted billions of dollars in resources in the criminal justice system by criminalizing otherwise law-abiding citizens at an alarming rate for simply possessing and consuming cannabis. In fact, we are today. According to Statistics Canada, in 2016, the most recent year of available data, there were about 55,000 offences related to cannabis reported to police, and police charged 17,733 people with pot possession. A recent Vice News investigation found that Black and Indigenous men and women have been overrepresented in cannabis possession arrests across Canada just in the years since the Liberals formed government. And yet, Bill C45 preserves the criminalized approach to cannabis, along with the damaging paternalism of the war on drugs. Now, I want to be clear that from the very beginning, Canada's New Democrats have worked hard to reach across the aisle with constructive proposals to improve this bill. These changes included the following: providing pardons to Canadians saddled with a criminal record for offences that will no longer be offences under C45. This amendment was ruled outside the scope of Bill C45, but given the Prime Minister's previous statements, it's shocking that the Liberal government would structure a so-called cannabis legalization bill in such a way that pardons cannot be included through amendment. We proposed empowering provincial governments to create parallel production licensing regimes in order to give provinces the flexibility to implement legalization in the manner best suited to their jurisdiction. For example, this would have allowed provinces to let craft growers, small-scale producers, and outdoor growers compete against the federally licensed corporate giants. As said earlier, we proposed the legalization of edibles and concentrates, which is among the safest way to consume cannabis, which is the growing part of the market, and which we know would allow Canadians and the entrepreneurs and businesses across this country to provide safe, regulated products to customers instead of allowing this to be provided underground. We proposed decriminalizing the penalties section in line with the Tobacco Act. We propose that this legalization should take a regulatory approach with significant fines for offences rather than criminal ones. One of the purposes of Bill C45, as laid out in Section 7, is to, quote, reduce the burden on the criminal justice system in relation to cannabis. We think penalties in the bill should be consistent with that stated intent. Now, I'm disappointed that the government chose to reject these vital proposals, but I'm heartened that this bill at least contains a mandatory review of C45's operation in the next Parliament. I view this as a tacit admission by the government that they know that this bill contains problematic sections that will need to be fixed. Madam Speaker, to be clear, Canada's New Democrats will support this motion and this legislation because we have fought for an end to prohibition ever since the 1971 Ledane Commission. The bill before us today is an important step forward, but it is far from perfect. Now, after the last election, Canadians rightfully expected that the Liberals would produce a timely and fair cannabis law. But as it now stands, the federal government has left the heavy lifting of legalization to the provincial, territorial, municipal and Indigenous governments. This bill will lead to the emergence of a patchwork approach to legalization that will shut out the most long-standing cannabis activists, the folks who spent decades honing the craft and providing world-leading medicinal cannabis to patients across Canada. Some provinces have chosen to impose a government retail monopoly, some have chosen to shut out existing compassion clubs, and some provinces are pushing to ban growing up outright. This is disappointing. It is a lost opportunity. It is a betrayal of the clear promise that the Liberals made to Canadians in 2015. Madam Speaker, done properly, an appropriate legal approach to cannabis can achieve impressive benefits economically, technologically, and medicinally. And New Democrats will continue to work to provide the best cannabis legislation that we can in the world for Canadians. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I thank the member for his remarks. But, you know, when he began his remarks by making some, quite frankly, very disparaging remarks and named a number of individuals and suggesting somehow that they had done something improper, I just wanted to advise the member, because I know the member well, and I know he would never knowingly disparage an innocent Canadian, and I know he believes, as I do, that parliamentary privilege is not a license to slander innocent Canadians. And I just wanted to advise him that of the 5 people he mentioned as having some kind of privileged access to the cannabis business through Health Canada, that 4 of those individuals were denied in their license application and were not successful and are no longer in any way associated to the licensed cannabis industry. And the one who actually was approved by the previous government when the Conservatives were in power. And so I just wanted to give, through you, Madam Speaker, I wanted to give the member opposite an opportunity to apologize to those individuals who he unjustly disparaged.
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, Madam Speaker, I think the question reveals a sensitivity that is far in excess of what I actually said. I'm not going to apologize to this House for pointing out hypocrisy. When a former Conservative cabinet minister compared cannabis to murder and was part of the police process to actively prosecute Canadians for cannabis and now is rushing to profit from that industry. When former Prime Minister John Turner, who as Prime Minister of this country, could have brought in cannabis legalization or decriminalization if he wanted to, and chose instead to perpetuate a criminal approach to cannabis and is now seeking to profit from it. It's that kind of hypocrisy that I think it's rightful to point out and that Canadians deserve to know. At the same time, all those Canadians who have been working under this prohibitionist criminal regime, who have fought and put their liberty at risk, who have sometimes achieved criminal records, now under this legislation may not even be able to participate in the legalized market. I find that hypocritical. I find that unjust.
Hear, hear. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I have to say that I find it very disturbing listening to the debate in here and the breakneck speed that the Liberals and the NDP want to have this law come into place, and how our police agencies, including the RCMP, are not set up to handle how to deal with impaired driving. For those individuals in rural areas, like my riding of Selkirk Interlake Eastman, when they are actually now going to go out there, Madam Speaker, I'm trying to make a point here, and the member just keeps on it.
I just want to remind members, if they have anything to contribute, then they should stand up and attempt to be recognized. The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
The member needs to be very aware that there is going to be now a process to determine the level of impairment. Right now, if you're caught with any type of narcotic in your system, it's a legal activity. But now we're going to have to determine whether or not that individual is driving under the influence of marijuana. And of course, we only have so much resources in rural areas. In my riding of Selkirk Interlake Eastman, which is about the same size as of the state of Israel, what we're looking at is maybe 1 or 2 officers in the entire region that will have the ability to make that determination on whether or not somebody's impaired. And if that individual is on leave, if that individual is taking time off or it's not his shift, how are we ever going to charge anyone and that's going to give free license to everybody to be out there driving under the influence of marijuana?
The member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, thank you. I think I speak for every member of this House, and we can join issue with the fact that nobody countenances or endorses any Canadian operating any kind of machinery, whether a motor vehicle or anything, or coming to work under the influence of cannabis. We all agree with that. But I would also point out it's against the law now. You cannot operate a motor vehicle under the influence of cannabis now. And Canadians should be well aware of that. We have impaired driving laws in this country. The current law that's before the Senate, Bill C45, is an attempt to modernize that law with a specific focus on cannabis. And there are certain problems with that bill too, by the way, which is it seems to be quite difficult right now to get an accurate reading of impairment or to set an appropriate per se blood limit reading for cannabis. So there's some problems with that. But at the moment, we all know that driving under the influence of cannabis is against the law and it should be treated that way. What I do want to talk about is whether we're ready or not. You know, I think very many times Canadians are ahead of politicians. And I'll tell you, I think the vast majority of Canadians who have voted with their actions for years now, millions of Canadians have used cannabis and continue to use cannabis, and they don't feel that they're criminals in doing so. This law is an attempt, I think, to catch up to the reality in Canada.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, last year I stayed in Ottawa on July 1st for Canada Day celebrations. And it was kind of a disappointing day because it rained really bad. And then I felt a lot of the music had nothing to do with Canada's heritage or history. But anyways, we'll leave that aside. But what I did notice last year, being here in Canada Day, was that Wellington was pretty well plugged with people trying to wait to get in here. Thousands and thousands of people trying to get through security to get onto Ottawa main grounds up here. And I wonder if, through you, Madam Speaker, if the member can just put his imagination out there and just imagine all of them having a little bit of smoke or a little toke or whatever you want to call it. You know, we have Rib Fest. It's coming next week. And you know how this town smells so great with Rib Fest? Imagine what Wellington would smell like with 10,000 people smoking marijuana. I wonder if you can imagine that.
It's running out of time, so I'll allow the member for Vancouver Kingsway to respond.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm going to end by asking the honourable member to use his imagination as well, and that's focus on a piece of this bill that I think is another problem with it, and that is this bill prevents the exportation of recreational cannabis products. You know, the amount of money and the ability for Canada to become a world leader in cannabis and cannabis products as countries around the world start to legalize, and they are and they will, as California has done, as Colorado has done, as Washington State has done, as many other states in the Union have done, and many jurisdictions across the world have done. The ability to support our entrepreneurs who can develop safe, healthy, high-quality products for the world is something that we should be supporting, I think, in this House. And imagine Canada being a world leader in a new product that is regarded around the world as being of the highest quality and safe. That's the kind of policy we should be working to develop in this House of Commons.
It being 5:30 p.m., the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business, according to the order on today's
Government orders. Resuming debate on C45, Cannabis Act.
Questions and comments remaining. Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
Lee Aldergrove.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Check with your desk.
I want to ask the member what he thinks about the growing of marijuana in residential. The Senate has recommended that it would be up to the provinces to decide whether or not it would be legal to grow marijuana, recreational marijuana, 4 plants, which is actually 12 plants. And would he agree with the recommendation of the Senate that it be up to the provinces?
Honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, thank you, my honourable colleague, for the question. There's a couple of factual points I'd like to make. First of all, the legislation says that it would allow Canadians to grow up to 4 plants per household. He made a reference to 12 plants. I'm not sure where that comes from. Yes, we on this side of the House do believe that that is a reasonable and proper provision of this bill. It was the task force on cannabis and regulation headed by Anne McClellan that did an exhaustive examination of this issue and decided to recommend that Canadians should be able to grow 4 plants. As the member may know, under the Supreme Court of Canada's decision, Canadians have the constitutional right to grow medicinal cannabis. It would seem quite perverse if one house on a block could be able to grow cannabis legally because they're growing it for medicinal use, and the house beside them was not able to grow it simply because of the different purpose. I also would point out that every single jurisdiction in the United States, Washington, Colorado, Oregon, California this year, all permit the growing of marijuana in reasonable limits and with reasonable parameters around it. It's a sensible way. If you want to have legalization of cannabis in this country, you have to trust Canadians to be able to responsibly use cannabis and to grow plants like any other plant, as long as, of course, it's done responsibly and in a reasonable amount.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. About
23 hours or so ago, I wish you a good morning. So I take the chance to wish you a good evening. I want to talk about, first off, Madam Speaker, I'd like to say that I will be splitting my time with my colleague and honourable member from Vancouver Quadra. And I'd like to start off, before I give the formal part of my speech, by discussing an element that was brought up by the honourable member from Vancouver Queensway, who had spoken about a number of members of the Senate and others, as well as the Right Honourable John Turner, as to their potential financial interest in legalizing marijuana. And I understand that this is an issue of privilege. You can say what pleases you in this House, but I found it particularly unparliamentary that he would raise the record of someone who has served this country with distinction, with honour, in talking about the Right Honourable John Turner, who was, among many positions he occupied as Prime Minister of Canada, he also was the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Justice. He's a man of some advanced age, I believe, and I'd like to take the chance to wish him a happy birthday. He turned 89 quite recently. And I know it on good authority that he has zero interest in the legalization of marijuana or any pecuniary derivative thereof, Madam Speaker. So I won't presume bad faith on the side of the honourable member, and I hope that when he gets a chance to retract those words that he does so, because we are in fact talking about a person who served this country honourably, regardless of party lines, and I do hope that he does take the chance to retract those comments. Madame la Présidente, c'est avec plaisir que je prends.
Madam Speaker, it's a pleasure for me to speak in the House to deal with an amendment adopted by the Senate with respect to Bill C45. I'd like to congratulate the Senate for its very helpful work done on this legislation. Nevertheless, I believe some of the amendments would not allow us to meet the goals of the policy that inspires this legislation. I'd like to take the opportunity to emphasize Clause 5.2, which says it is understood that the present legislation will apply to all commercial provisions which prohibit the growing or harvesting of cannabis in a residence. It would allow residents to grow up to 5 plants. These plants could not be sold to another person, and whoever grew up to 4 plants or more than 4 plants would risk being faced with criminal accusations. The object of this provision has 2 components. First of all, the provision would be to counter the illegal market for cannabis, and second, it would contribute to preventing useless incriminations of Canadians who are growing cannabis and using it in a responsible way. Growing cannabis at home would be a legal source of cannabis to people who may not have access to an outlet for the sale of cannabis. This would allow a limited volume of cannabis for personal use to be similar to the provision that now exists for tobacco, for example. People can grow their own tobacco for their own consumption. And there are also Canadians who would maintain the cannabis and keep it in a safe place and use it only for their personal use. Following an investigation into cannabis, one of the questions the government asked was, where did people get their cannabis and where were they likely to have access to cannabis in the future? And all respondents, or most respondents, only 2% had thought of growing it themselves. So home cultivation of cannabis is compatible with the framework adopted by most American states which have legalized and regulated cannabis. these states have allowed home cultivation and allow people to grow up from 4 to 12 plants per residence. It's important to remember that Bill C45 was developed to allow provinces and territories to authorize the distribution and sale of cannabis on their territory and to add additional restrictions that are not proposed in the Cannabis Act, in particular with respect to personal use. This flexibility would allow local priorities to be compatible with the government's concerns for health in the Cannabis Act. The Canadian government believes that provinces and territories are best placed to assess the necessity for regulating on their territory. Most provinces will allow for the personal cultivation of up to 4 plants, as provided for in C45, but some provinces have decided to add restrictions. For example, New Brunswick, which will require that if cannabis is grown outside, there be a secure fence, and that this area be locked. In Nova Scotia, they have said that they would allow owners, building owners, to forbid people from growing or smoking cannabis in their buildings. There would be a tribunal that would examine the provincial regime, and it would be up to tribunals to decide whether there was a conflict with the federal legislation. Over the past 2 years, our government has held broad consultations, and so we are better equipped to move forward with this bill. Bill C45 is based on the recommendations of the working group I mentioned and reflects experts' points of view, and this during our vast series of consultations. It balances various points of view, those of municipalities, provinces and territories, Indigenous governments, and a huge spectrum of experts. Provincial and territorial governments have their own legislation they are preparing to bring in systems to regulate. Bill C45 would allow adults to grow up to 4 plants, and it would allow home growth in order to meet the government's objective, which is to replace the illegal market. This is in order to make sure that this activity will help, once again, to replace the illegal market. Home cultivation, in our opinion, helps in this approach. On the other hand, as you know, this bill contains a provision allowing for 7 provisions, rather, would deal with its coming into effect. When this happens, the minister will ensure that this will be reviewed later. So the government would then be ready to change the legislation, and it would make sure that the review looks into the growth of cannabis in residential buildings. Based on the proof we have now, on the testimony we have now, we believe that cannabis could be grown in a way that is compatible with concerns for health and security that are part of the legislation. People could use cannabis for their personally, and this is the approach adopted by the American states which have legalized cannabis. It is for all these reasons, Madam Speaker, that I will not support this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague from Surrey explained to me that where the 12 came from, and that it was you're allowed to have 4 mature plants, 4 immature plants, and 4 plants that were just being planted. So my question for the member opposite is that if you've got somebody with a prescription for marijuana and they're growing their 4 plants, and you have someone else in the household who does not have a prescription, does that mean they're allowed 8, which is really 24 plants? Because you're not supposed to share prescriptions with other people. And if there's another person in the house with a different prescription for medical marijuana, would they be allowed their 4 plants, which is really 12, and then there'd be 36 in the house? Just want to know how that's going to work. I think that multiplication is even right with Liberal gun registry math.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
So, Madam Speaker, far be it for me to give anyone math instructions, but the member should know and should well know that prescriptions are given on an individual basis and are not to be passed off. She should also know that on a medical basis, up to 30 grams are authorized. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Speaker, well, while we're correcting the record, I'll just tell my honourable colleague that I represent Vancouver Kingsway, not Queensway. But I want to read into the record exactly what I said earlier that seemed to have offended his feelings so much. I said this: an emerging group of cannabis capitalists composed of the same police officers and government officials who spent their careers prosecuting the war on drugs has already begun staking its claim to the new recreational market. Some notable names include Kim Derry, who served as deputy chief when the member for Scarborough Southwest was Toronto Police Chief, is now the security advisor for THC Meds. Former Ontario Liberal Deputy Premier George Smitherman, who once served as the province's health minister, also tied to the same company, former Liberal Prime Minister John Turner, is a board member for Mule Boom Organic Inc. Chuck Raffici founded Tweed Cannabis Inc., the country's first licensed provider, while he was CFO of the Liberal Party. And Julian Fantino, who once compared cannabis to murder and voted in favour of harsh mandatory minimum sentences for cannabis as a member of the Harper Cabinet, has now gotten into the cannabis business. It's a travesty of justice and hypocrisy of the highest order that those who fought hardest for legalization will benefit the least from it, while those who spent a lifetime enforcing prohibition are now filling the boardrooms of the cannabis industry. I'd like my honourable colleague to answer what was wrong with any of that, what's inaccurate, and why didn't John Turner, when he was Prime Minister, legalize cannabis if he now thinks that he should be on the board of directors of the company and profit from it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I would remind the honourable member he's speaking about a former Prime Minister, Right Honourable John Turner, who served this country honourably and in a very distinguished fashion. I see absolutely no remorse on the member's part, so I feel no particular compulsion or need to answer any further question. They're, as you have noted, Madam Speaker, quite leading. And I would encourage the member to examine his conscience a little more in depth and show a little bit of remorse and respect for the House and a respect for a former distinguished Prime Minister, distinguished Cabinet Minister, both in finance and for justice. And I think he should take a little time and think about what he just said. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Time for a brief question. The Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering if the member can advise us. I'm just wondering if the member can advise us. We've heard about education and all what the Liberal government was going to do regarding education. As a mother, I've received nothing, and I believe all parents haven't received anything. Where is this education that that the government promised 6 months ago?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Actually, quite a good question. If the member opposite has examined the fiscal framework that we have been discussing with provinces, she will note that we will be taking none of this for personal profit and investing it into fighting a lot of the ills that the consumption of cannabis has caused, including making sure that youth know about the ills of consuming cannabis, particularly the effect on the immature brain, and giving 75% to provinces and municipalities to make sure that they address the issues because they are in a good position to address it as well, making sure they put it through their streams to make sure the youth in particular know of the ills of consuming cannabis. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister. We have a point of order, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Madame la Présidente, Madam Speaker, I will say that it was impossible to come to an agreement with respect to 68.1 and 68.2 of the standing orders regarding the Act an act respecting cannabis and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. Under the standing orders, I give notice that at the next sitting of the House, there will be a motion put forth, and that there will.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues.
Point of order. The Honourable Member for, I don't know, it's Grasslands. Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Sorry to interrupt the proceedings here, but the end of her presentation was cut off by translation. We did not hear what the last probably 30 seconds of the presentation was.
So apparently there was an error with the translation. Would the Honourable Parliamentary House Leader or Government House Leader reread the last part of the proposal?
Put it in the record in English. Madam Speaker, I would like to advise that an agreement could not be reached under the provisions of Standing Orders 78.1 or 78.2 with respect to the consideration of certain amendments of Bill C45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. Under the provisions of Standing Order 78.3, I give notice that a Minister of the Crown will propose at the next sitting a motion to allot a specific number of days or hours for the consideration and disposal of proceedings at the said stage. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Translation was clear. Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise to speak to the message from the other place on Bill C45. But before I start my remarks on that, I want to say that this is a very historic time, and it's a time that I am very proud of this legislation, this change, this vast change in social policy that we are making as a government. Madam Speaker, if we reflect on what it's like to go out for dinner with friends and have a beer or a glass of wine with dinner, and we think about the fact that there was a time when that was illegal and the provision of alcohol was controlled by the criminal underworld, and the act of partaking in alcohol was a crime. And it's almost impossible to imagine that made sense at an earlier period, and it certainly doesn't make sense to us today. And in the same way, I think in the future we will be looking back at a time when cannabis was illegal, where it was criminalized, where it was purveyed by criminal gangs, and we will it's in a future day, the public in Canada will not be able to imagine how that could have made sense. And in fact, it doesn't make sense. And so that's why I'm so proud of what we're doing today. It doesn't make sense because it hasn't worked. Having the use of cannabis be a criminal matter as opposed to a health and safety matter just makes no sense. It creates massive profits for the Hells Angels and other organized criminals. It provides no safety in terms of what might be in the content of the product that is being consumed or what might be harmful. And, Madam Speaker, make no mistake, it is being consumed as an illegal activity notwithstanding, as a criminalized activity notwithstanding. Our young people are using this product at higher rates than virtually anywhere in the world. And so this is time, it's far past time to actually take the control and regulation out of the hands of the criminal underworld where they've been profiting from it and place the control and regulation into the hands of government where health and safety aspects can actually be addressed by the government. And that's exactly why in 2011, after the election, I began to have this discussion in Ottawa with Liberal colleagues and saying, I think it's time we address the situation and we actually consider legalizing marijuana as a party. and I had the privilege of bringing a film called The Union, a documentary about the control and all of the negative aspects of that for our society, the control of cannabis by the criminal underworld, the kinds of shootouts on open streets in broad daylight in our cities when there were gang wars, the drawing into criminal activity of young people that were being recruited by the gangs to be part of their distribution network, and the hundreds of thousands of young Canadians that ended up in the justice system because of their involvement with cannabis. So it's with great pride and humility that I want to acknowledge this Parliament and this government for what we are doing here. This is a historic time. In 2011, it looked pretty impossible, I have to say, but our Prime Minister took the bull by the horns, made this commitment into our last election platform, and we have proceeded with this project. So, Madam Speaker, I'm now going to talk about some of the details of implementation so that we actually do this as best as we possibly can as a Parliament and as a government. So as others have already pointed out, both Houses of Parliament have conducted extensive studies of the proposed Cannabis Act. In the other place, Bill C45 was studied by 5 different committees, which heard from over 200 experts and witnesses. 4 of those committees conducted an in-depth study of the specific aspects of the legislation and its implications. They've carefully assessed issues related to criminal law provisions, Indigenous persons, international obligations, and Canada's borders. And I want to add my voice to those who've acknowledged this important contribution and to thank the other place for its extensive work on this bill. As you know, the study of this proposed legislation by Parliament built on extensive work by the Task Force on Legalization and Regulation. In 2016, after the previous election, the Task Force undertook extensive consultations to hear from Canadians, from public health experts, law enforcement, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, Indigenous organizations, U.S. state governments with more experience administering cannabis regimes, and more. The proposed act was developed largely on the basis of the thoughtful advice of this task force, and the act has been carefully designed to support the policy objectives that are stated in Clause 7. It was carefully designed to ensure that its provisions comply with privacy and other obligations and respect the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So for these reasons, the amendments proposed by the other place had to be very carefully reviewed and assessed on the basis of whether they would support the bill's policy objectives and whether they could have unintended consequences. Based on this review, it is clear that some amendments would further improve the bill, in fact, the majority of the amendments brought forward, and they support its objectives. Others are problematic. For example, the amendment that would further clarify the requirements and the scope for the legislative review that will be undertaken 3 years after the coming into force of the Act is a positive improvement to the legislation. This amendment will establish a clear timeline of 18 months following the beginning of the review for the Minister to table in Parliament a report on the findings of the review. In line with the objective of a separate amendment in the other place, it is proposed that the Act clearly indicate that this legislative review will carefully consider the impacts of this legislation on public health, including on youth, the impacts on Indigenous peoples, and the impacts of home cultivation. On the other hand, however, a number of amendments adopted in the other place cannot be supported as they could create significant issues. This is the case, for example, of an amendment that would require that the Minister collect and publicly disclose the names of every holder of a license or permit, including persons who have control of or have shares in corporations holding a license. This amendment would raise concerns from a privacy perspective and impose requirements on businesses operating in the legal cannabis industry that would be inconsistent with how businesses operate in other Canadian industries are treated. And it would pose issues from an operational perspective. For example, the volatility of shareholding in a publicly traded corporation could make the proposed reporting requirements practically impossible to meet and could cause extreme delays in licensing. Health Canada has a robust physical and personnel security screening process in place for the existing cannabis for medical purposes industry designed to guard against infiltration by organized crime. All officers and directors of a company must undergo thorough law enforcement record checks prior to licensing. As a part of the new regulatory framework, Health Canada has proposed to expand the list of individuals that would require a security clearance to include the directors and officers of any controlling company, in addition to those of the licensed company. As we finalize our study of Bill C45, I urge all parliamentarians to remember that this legislative framework is one of the pillars of a comprehensive public health approach the government is proposing to better protect Canadians and minimize the harms associated with cannabis use. The government is taking action in a number of key areas informed by the strict regulatory controls that are currently in place for Canadians who access cannabis for medical purposes and lessons learned from our considerable success in taking a public health approach for reducing tobacco smoking rates. Our strategies include efforts to educate Canadians about the harms and risks of cannabis use, promote healthy choices and reduce youth access, prevent problematic and high-risk patterns of use, and many more. Madam Speaker, it's important we consider the proposed legislation in the context of broader, proven strategies for protecting public health. The government has taken every reasonable action to ensure this bill is designed to take those things into account. I am proud of Bill C45 and proud to
The honourable member will have 5 minutes of questions and comments left the next time this matter is before the House. Comme il est minuit, conformément à
Pursuant to order made on Tuesday, May 29, 2018, the motion adjourns and is now deemed to have been the motion to adjourn is now deemed to have been adopted.